It was not meant as a compliment, though humans never seemed to notice, or perhaps they simply did not care, and that was the part that confused everyone the most. For 120 years, humanity had been a member of the Galactic Concord, a grand coalition of 46 spacefaring civilizations that governed the known stars from a massive neutral station called Araxis Prime. And in all that time, not once had a human warship fired a single shot in interstellar space. Not once. Other species had carved their empires through blood and fire and the screaming of worlds. But humans had walked onto the galactic stage with open hands and warm smiles, and an almost absurd willingness to talk. And the galaxy had looked at them the way a predator looks at something too small to eat. The three greatest powers in the Concord were the Dralith hegemony, a civilization of tall reptilian warriors who believed that strength was the only language worth speaking. Voron Collective, a hive-minded species that expanded like a slow flood across every system they touched. And the Siluri Dominion, ancient beings made of living energy who had existed for so long they considered every younger species to be little more than children playing with tools they did not understand. These three ruled the galaxy in all the ways that mattered, and they tolerated humanity the way a king tolerates a jester. Useful, entertaining, and utterly beneath concern. And at the center of this quiet humiliation stood Consul Marindal. She was Earth's voice in the Senate, a tall woman with silver-streaked dark hair and calm brown eyes that never seemed to blink at the wrong moment. And she had held that position for 20 years, which meant she had spent 20 years smiling through insults that would have made lesser diplomats weep. The Dralith called humans the soft ones in their own language, and they did not bother to hide it. Voron referred to Earth's colonies as unattended resources in official documents, as if human worlds were simply waiting to be collected. The Siluri did not even address Marin directly most days, preferring to speak through intermediaries, as though a human voice was beneath their attention. And through all of it, Marin smiled. She brokered peace between warring factions. She negotiated trade deals that benefited species who openly mocked her. She sat through Senate sessions where Earth's proposals were dismissed before she finished speaking. And she never once raised her voice, never once showed anger, never once gave anyone a reason to think that humanity was anything other than what the galaxy believed it to be. Harmless, patient, weak. Then the Voron Collective made a mistake. It began with the Helios Corridor, a critical trade route that connected Earth's outer colony worlds to the rest of human space, and through it flowed food, and medicine and fuel and all the things that kept 300,000 human civilians alive on the frontier. The Voran had been eyeing the corridor for decades, and one morning, without warning and without negotiation, they simply took it. A Voran battle fleet dropped out of fold space at both ends of the corridor and established a full military blockade, and within hours, 3 human colony systems were completely cut off from the rest of civilization. The colonies had enough supplies for maybe 6 weeks. Children would start going hungry in 4. When the news reached Araxis Prime, Marin moved fast, and she filed an emergency motion in the Senate demanding the immediate withdrawal of Voran forces and the restoration of free passage through the corridor. It was the correct move, the legal move, the diplomatic move, and it required a majority vote from the Senate to pass. The minor species voted in favor almost unanimously, because they had all been bullied by the Voron at some point, and they understood what it meant when a great power simply reached out and took what it wanted. But the Dralith hegemon abstained, and the Siluri Dominion abstained, and without the support of at least one other great power, the motion died on the Senate floor like a candle blown out by an indifferent wind. The Voron ambassador, a towering insectoid figure named Vreth Ka, stood before the Senate and delivered a statement that was broadcast across the galaxy. The Helios corridor falls within the natural expansion zone of the collective, Vrethka said, its voice buzzing with the harmonic resonance of 1,000 linked minds. This is a minor territorial correction, nothing more, and we see no reason to discuss it further. Then Vrethka turned to Marin, and in front of every delegation, every camera, every listening ear in the known galaxy, it said something that would be remembered for a very long time. Your people should be grateful we tolerate your presence at all. The chamber went quiet. Not the respectful quiet of consideration, but the uncomfortable quiet of a room full of beings who knew they had just witnessed something cruel and chose to say nothing about it. Every eye turned to Marin. She stood at her podium, her hands resting on the surface, her face perfectly still, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. Then she smiled. It was the same smile she had worn for 20 years, calm and measured and utterly without heat, and she inclined her head in a small nod, the way she always did when a conversation was over, and she gathered her things and walked out of the Senate chamber without a word. The doors closed behind her. The galaxy exhaled, and the consensus among every species, every intelligence network, every political analyst from one end of known space to the other was exactly the same. The humans had accepted their place. Again. Because that was what humans did. They accepted, they absorbed, they bent, and the galaxy had long since stopped wondering if there was a limit to how far they could be pushed. But as Marin walked down the long corridor outside the Senate chamber, her aide, a young man named Tobias, fell into step beside her, and he could see something that the cameras had not caught. Her hands were shaking. Not with fear, with rage. "Ma'am," Tobias said quietly, "what do we do now?" Marin did not slow down, and she did not look at him, and when she spoke, her voice was so calm it was almost frightening. "Now we go home," she said, "and we stop being polite." Tobias had worked for Marin for 6 years, and in all that time he had never once been afraid of her. He was afraid of her now. Somewhere in the galaxy, 300,000 human civilians waited for food that was not coming, and the great powers of the Concord went back to their business, confident that the soft species had once again accepted the natural order of things. It was buried beneath the old city of Geneva, 3 kilometers below the surface, encased in walls that could withstand a planetary bombardment, and shielded by technology that no galactic sensor had ever penetrated. And it had been there since the very first year humanity made contact with alien life. 12 people sat around a curved table, and they were the most powerful human beings alive, though not a single one of them had ever appeared on a public broadcast or held a title that any civilian would recognize. They were the keepers of a secret that had been passed down through 6 generations of leadership, guarded with a discipline that bordered on obsession, and that secret had a name: the Prometheus Doctrine. It had been written 120 years ago, in the weeks after humanity's first encounter with an alien species, when the leaders of Earth looked out at a galaxy full of civilizations that had been conquering and killing each other for millennia, and came to a very simple conclusion. If they see what we really are, they will destroy us before we are ready. So humanity made a choice. They would be kind, they would be helpful, they would be soft, and they would smile at every insult, and bow at every slight. And while the galaxy watched the lamb, they would build a lion in the dark. The Prometheus Doctrine was not a defensive plan, and it was not a contingency, and it was not a set of guidelines for a possible future. It was the single most ambitious military deception in the history of any civilization, and it had been running flawlessly for over a century. Hansel Marindal stood before the council now, and for the first time in 20 years, she was not smiling. "They blockaded the Helios corridor," she said, and her voice was flat and hard, and completely without the warmth that the galaxy had come to associate with her. 300,000 civilians, including 40,000 children, are cut off from food and medical supplies, and the Senate did nothing because the Dralith and the Siluri decided our people were not worth the effort of raising a hand. She paused. I have smiled for 20 years, she said. I am done smiling. The council did not deliberate for long, because in truth, they had been preparing for this moment since before Marin was born, and every person in that room had always known that one day the galaxy would push humanity too far, and when that day came, the mask would have to fall. The vote was unanimous. Prometheus Doctrine, Phase Final. And with those words, humanity began to reveal what it had built in the darkness. The first revelation was the Ghost Fleet. For over a century, human shipyards hidden inside hollowed-out asteroids and deep space stations that no galactic survey had ever mapped had been building warships, and not just a few, not just a defensive force, but a full armada. Over 4,000 vessels, each one folded into dimensional pocket space where no sensor could detect them. These were not copies of alien technology, though alien technology had certainly been studied, and in many cases taken apart and understood better than its creators understood it. These were something new. Human engineers had a gift that no other species seemed to possess, which was the ability to look at 5 different systems, built by 5 different civilizations, and see not just how each one worked, but how they could all work together, improved, combined, and reimagined into something none of the original builders had ever dreamed of. The Ghost Fleet was the result of that gift, and it was the most advanced military force in the galaxy, and no one knew it existed. The second revelation was Project Stillwater. Over the past 80 years, humanity had seeded tens of thousands of stealth drones across every major power's territory. Small and so quiet that they drifted through alien space like dust particles, invisible and patient, and each one was positioned near something critical: a planetary shield generator, a communications hub, a jump gate, a military command center. If activated, Stillwater could blind, deafen, and paralyze any of the 3 great powers in a matter of minutes. Not hours. Minutes. The third revelation was the Warden. Every major galactic power had artificial intelligence of some kind. The Voron had their linked hive-mind processors. The Dralith had brute-force tactical computers. The Siluri had ancient calculation matrices older than most civilizations. But the Warden was something none of them had ever conceived of. It was not just intelligent, it was creative. Modeled on human neural patterns, the Warden could think the way a human thought, with intuition and improvisation and the kind of unpredictable lateral reasoning that turned losing battles into victories, and it had been running war simulations against every known galactic power for decades, learning, adapting, and preparing. When the Council had once asked the Warden to estimate the probability of a successful defense against a combined assault by all 3 great powers simultaneously, the Warden had paused for exactly 2 seconds, and then replied, "You said defense. Would you like me to calculate the probability of a successful offense instead, because those numbers are significantly better?" The fourth and final revelation was the Aegis Marines. For over a century, every human colony had maintained what the galaxy knew as colonial security personnel, lightly armed peacekeepers who handled local disputes and natural disasters, and looked exactly as harmless as the galaxy expected humans to look. They were not harmless. They were the most heavily augmented, extensively trained, and deeply conditioned soldiers any species had ever produced, and there were 250,000 of them spread across human space, hiding in plain sight, waiting for a call that many of them had started to believe would never come. It was coming now. General Idris Okonkwo, the commander of the Aegis program, stood before the Council and delivered a readiness report in 6 words. "We have been ready for decades. Period." Marin looked around the room at the faces of the people who held humanity's greatest secret, and she saw no hesitation, no doubt, and no fear. Only the grim, focused resolve of a species that had spent a century pretending to be something it was not. "I want to be clear about what we are doing," she said. "We are not starting a war. We are ending the possibility that anyone will ever think they can start one with us. And we are going to do it without firing a single shot, if that is at all possible. Because that is who we are." She straightened. "But if they force our hand, then they will learn something that every human already knows, that the most dangerous creature in any room is the one that has been quiet the longest." The council adjourned. Within hours, the ghost fleet began to unfold from dimensional pocket space. 4,000 warships shimmering into existence like ghosts stepping out of a dream. And across the galaxy, Stillwater drones received their activation codes and began to hum with quiet, terrible purpose. The lamb was gone, and the lion was opening its eyes. On Araxis Prime, the galaxy continued as it always had. The great powers issued decrees, and the minor species obeyed, and the trade routes hummed with commerce, and no one looked twice at the human delegation's empty seats in the Senate chamber. The message arrived at the same time on 3 different worlds, delivered through 3 different channels, each one encrypted with methods that should have been impossible for humans to possess. It was addressed to the Draelith High Command, the Voron Queen Council, and the Siluri Elder Circle, and it said the same thing in all 3 languages. Consul Marandal of Earth requests a private meeting with the senior ambassadors of the 3 great powers aboard Araxis Prime. No aids, no records, no surveillance, within 24 hours, regarding a matter of existential importance. The word existential was what caught their attention. Not because they believed humans could threaten their existence, of course. That was laughable. But because it was such an unusual word for a human diplomat to use, and the sheer audacity of the request was intriguing enough to accept. After all, what harm could it do? They had nothing to fear from the soft species. Ambassador Vrethka of the Voron Collective arrived first, its massive insectoid body clicking across the polished floor of the private chamber, with the casual arrogance of a creature that had never once doubted its own superiority. Parentheses. Ambassador Korath of the Draelith Hegemony came next, 7 feet of scaled muscle and gleaming teeth, wearing ceremonial armor that was not entirely ceremonial, because a Draelith was never truly unarmed. Parentheses. Ambassador Lumineth of the Siluri Dominion arrived last, drifting into the room as a shimmering column of pale golden light, ancient and beautiful, and radiating the quiet contempt that the Siluri reserved for all things younger than themselves. They settled into their positions, and they waited, and there was an unspoken amusement among them, because this was going to be entertaining, watching the human beg. The door opened, and Marin walked in. She was alone. She carried nothing except a small crystal, larger than a coin, held between her thumb and forefinger, and she walked to the center of the room and stood there, facing all 3 of them, and she did not sit down. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her voice was pleasant, her posture was relaxed, and her face wore the same calm expression the galaxy had seen for 2 decades. And the 3 ambassadors exchanged glances that ranged from bored to mildly curious. "You mentioned existential importance," Korath rumbled, his deep voice vibrating through the floor. "We are listening, human, but do not waste our time." "I will not waste your time," Marin said. "In fact, I intend to save you quite a lot of it." She placed the crystal on the table between them. "This contains the current real-time locations of every Draelith dreadnought in your fleet, Ambassador Korath, including the 12 ships you have hidden in the Black Veil Nebula that your own Senate does not know about. Breathing, P. It also contains the precise coordinates of every Voron hive carrier, Ambassador Vrethka, including the 3 queen ships you relocated last month to what you believed were undetectable positions in the outer reach." Vrethka's mandibles went still. P. And for you, Ambassador Lumineth, Marin continued, turning to the column of light. It contains the locations of every Siluri energy nexus in your territory, including the 7 ancient nodes that your people consider sacred and have never revealed to any outsider in the entire history of your civilization. P. The light that was Lumineth flickered. For a very long time, no one spoke. Marin let the silence do its work, because silence was a weapon she had spent 20 years learning to use, and she knew exactly how long to let it stretch before it became unbearable. You are wondering how we obtained this information, she said. The answer is that we have had assets inside your territories. For decades, undetected, uninterrupted, and fully operational. And you never knew because you never thought to look, because you believed we were harmless. She folded her hands in front of her. I am here to correct that belief. Vreth-Ka recovered first, because the Voron hive mind processed shock faster than individual consciousness could. This is a bluff, Vreth-Ka said, though its voice had lost the buzzing confidence it usually carried. You cannot possibly. Verify the crystal, Marin said. I will wait. And she did wait, standing perfectly still in the center of the room, while the 3 most powerful ambassadors in the galaxy contacted their respective intelligence agencies through secure channels and asked them to check the data on the crystal. It took 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, Marin did not move, did not fidget, did not show a single sign of anxiety, and the 3 ambassadors watched her with growing unease, because they were beginning to understand that the woman standing before them was not the person they had spent 20 years believing her to be. The confirmations came back one by one. The Drelith Intelligence Service confirmed that every ship location was accurate, including the ones in the Black Veil Nebula. The Voron hive mind confirmed the Queen ship positions down to the exact coordinate. The Siluri Elder Circle confirmed the Nexus locations and immediately demanded to know how this was possible. Marin watched the realization settle over them like a cold fog. Now that we understand each other, she said, here are Earth's terms. She turned to Vreth-Ka. You will withdraw all Voron forces from the Helios Corridor within 72 hours. You will release every human system you have blockaded, and you will issue a formal apology to every civilian your blockade has affected, not to Earth's government, only to the civilians, by name. Vreth-Ka's voice trembled with restrained fury. Mandibles trembled, but it said nothing. She turned to Korath. You abstained from the vote that could have prevented this crisis, and in doing so you told the galaxy that human lives are not worth your concern. You will never do that again, and you will make certain that your government understands why. Korath's claws scraped against the table, but he did not speak. She turned to Lumineth. You are the oldest civilization in the known galaxy, and you have carried yourselves with the assumption that your nature makes you invulnerable. Marin paused. Do not test whether we have found a way to destabilize energy-based biology, Ambassador, because I assure you, we have, and the results of our testing were deeply unpleasant for the simulated subjects. The golden light dimmed. Marin stepped back. I am giving you 72 hours, she said. That is more courtesy than you showed my people when you cut off food to their children. Reached out and picked up the crystal from the table. Politeness ends now, she said. What comes next is your choice. Then she turned and walked out of the room, and the door closed behind her. And for the first time in the recorded history of the Galactic Concord, the ambassadors of the 3 most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy sat in absolute silence, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were afraid, not of what Marin had told them, but of what she had not told them. Because if this was what humanity was willing to reveal, then what were they still hiding? Across the galaxy, intelligence networks began to burn with frantic encrypted communications, as the 3 great powers scrambled to understand how everything they believed about humans had been so catastrophically, so completely, so dangerously wrong. and in her quarters on Araxes Prime, Marin Dahl sat down in a chair, and closed her eyes, and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 20 years. The Voron Collective's military caste refused to believe that a species they had dismissed for over a century could pose any real threat, and the war commanders buzzed with fury and wounded pride and the particular kind of rage that comes from discovering you have been made to look like a fool. "They are bluffing," Supreme Commander Kethvor declared to the Queen Council. "They have intelligence, yes, but intelligence is not power, and we are the Voron. We do not retreat because a soft species shows us a list of our own ships." But the Queen Council was not as certain, because the queens were old and cautious, and they had not survived for 10,000 years by ignoring threats, simply because those threats came from unexpected places. "Verify everything," the first queen ordered. "Find these assets they claim to have inside our territory, find them and destroy them, and then we will decide whether to laugh or to worry." The Voron Intelligence Service began scanning their own space with every tool they possessed, and it took them less than 3 hours to find the first human stealth drone. It was the size of a grain of sand. It was floating 17 meters from the first queen's private chamber. And when they found it, its tiny sensor array turned toward the scanner that had detected it, almost as if it was looking at them. And then it transmitted a single pulse of data directly to the Queen Council's own communication network. A pulse that contained a message in perfect Voron harmonic language. "You found one. There are 800,000 more. Good luck." The military caste stopped talking about bluffs after that. On the Draelith homeworld, the reaction was different but no less dramatic. The Draelith were warriors, and warriors respected strength. And what the humans had just demonstrated was not mere strength, but something far more terrifying. It was patience, and the Draelith had a deep, cultural fear of patient enemies, because their own history taught them that the opponent who waits is the opponent who has already won. Grand Admiral Thesgra ordered the entire hegemony fleet to battle stations, and began repositioning his dreadnoughts to defend key systems, and that was when the Ghost Fleet appeared. Not all of it, just enough. At the edges of Draelith territory, in 7 different systems, simultaneously, human warships began to shimmer into existence, folding out of dimensional pocket space, like shadows becoming solid, and the Draelith long-range sensors lit up with contact signatures that should not have been possible. 700 warships, in 7 systems, appearing from nowhere, and each one was broadcasting a simple identification signal that read Earth Naval Vessel, followed by a registration number, as if they were civilian transport ships checking in at a spaceport, as if this was routine, as if they had always been. Grand Admiral Thesgra stared at the tactical display, and counted the signatures, and felt something he had not felt since he was a hatchling. Fear. Not because 700 ships were enough to threaten the hegemony, although they were formidable, but because if the humans had 700 ships here, casually visible, deliberately revealed, then how many more were still hidden in places the Draelith had not thought to look? The answer, which Thesgra did not yet know, but strongly suspected, was thousands. The Siluri Dominion's response was the most composed and the most unsettling. The Siluri were beings of pure energy, ancient beyond comprehension, and they had always believed themselves to be fundamentally invulnerable, because how do you fight light itself? How do you wound something that has no body? How do you threaten a consciousness that exists as a pattern of electromagnetic force? They had considered this question settled, for longer than most species had existed. So when their researchers located one of the human stealth drones near an energy nexus in the Shimmer Expanse, they did not panic. They simply reached out with a standard containment field to capture and study it. The drone self-destructed. The explosion was tiny, barely a flash, but it released a micropulse on a frequency that the Siluri had never encountered. a frequency that resonated with the specific electromagnetic patterns that made up Siluri consciousness. 3 researchers who were within range of the pulse flickered. Their forms destabilized, their coherence fractured, and for approximately 4 seconds, 3 of the oldest living beings in the galaxy experienced something they had never experienced before. The sensation of dying. They recovered, their patterns restabilized, and they were not permanently harmed, but the terror of those 4 seconds spread through the Siluri dominion faster than light itself, because it answered the question that the Siluri had believed was settled forever. How do you fight light itself? Apparently the humans had figured that out too. As the hours ticked by, something else began to happen. Something the great powers had not anticipated. The minor species of the galactic concord started to move. Dozens of smaller civilizations that had spent generations under the boot of one great power or another began to openly voice support for Earth. And at first, this seemed like nothing more than political noise, small voices shouting into a storm. But then the Jalvari Confederation announced that it had maintained a mutual defense pact with Earth for the past 60 years. No one had known. Then the Tesserae Republic made the same announcement, and then the Oran Free States, and then the Benathi League, and one by one, like candles being lit in a dark room, 11 minor species revealed that they had been quietly allied with humanity for decades, and each one declared that an attack on Earth would be considered an attack on all of them. The great powers suddenly realized that humanity had not just been building weapons in the dark, they had been building alliances. At the 48-hour mark, the Drelith homonymy broke first. A back-channel message arrived at Earth's embassy on Araxis Prime, unsigned but unmistakably from Grand Admiral Thesk Ra himself, and it contained 6 words: "We will no longer abstain, ever." At the 60-hour mark, the Siluri Dominion issued a formal statement, the first of its kind in over 2,000 years, and it was only 1 sentence long, but it shook the foundations of galactic politics. The Siluri Dominion recognizes humanity as a peer civilization. The word peer had never been used by the Siluri to describe any other species in their entire recorded history. And then at the 71st hour, with 59 minutes remaining on Marin's deadline, the Varan Collective withdrew from the Helios Corridor. The blockade dissolved like mist in sunlight. The battle fleet folded back into Varan space, and a formal apology was transmitted on every open frequency in the galaxy. It was not addressed to Earth's government. It was addressed to every civilian in the blockaded systems, by name, all 300,000 of them, and it expressed regret in terms so specific and so personal that it was clear the Varan had spent considerable effort learning exactly who they had hurt. The first supply ships reached the colonies within hours. On a small world called Haven's Rest, a 6-year-old girl named Lily Chen watched a cargo shuttle descend through the clouds, carrying food her family had not had in weeks, and she waved at it as it landed. And she did not know anything about galactic politics or stealth drones or ghost fleets. She just knew that the sky had opened up. Someone had remembered she was there. In Geneva, General Okonkwo watched the data feeds and allowed himself a single nod. In Araxis Prime, Marin received the Voron withdrawal confirmation and set it down on her desk and stared at it for a long time. No shots had been fired. No worlds had burned. No one had died. A century of patience had been justified in 71 hours, and the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. But Marin knew this was not the end. This was the beginning, because fear fades and wounded pride festers, and the only way to make this peace last was to change the rules of the game itself. The same seats, the same curved walls of polished stone, the same soft lighting that was designed to make every species feel equally at ease. the same circular floor where hundreds of delegations sat in tiered rows facing the central podium. Everything was exactly as it had been a week ago. But nothing was the same. The minor species sat differently now, straighter, with their heads higher and their voices louder in the corridors before the session began. And they looked at each other with something that had not existed in this place for a very long time: hope. The great powers sat differently too, though the change in them was harder to name. It was not defeat exactly, and it was not shame. It was something more like the careful stillness of someone who has just learned that the ground beneath their feet is not as solid as they believed. The Draelith delegation was present in full ceremonial formation, but Ambassador Korat's eyes moved restlessly across the chamber as if seeing it for the first time. The Voron delegation was reduced to half its usual size, and Vreth Ka sat motionless, its mandibles folded tight, its compound eyes fixed on the floor. The Siluri delegation, usually a blinding display of golden light and ancient grandeur, had dimmed itself to a soft glow, and Ambassador Lumineth hovered near the back of the Siluri section instead of at the front, which was a gesture of humility that no living being in the chamber had ever witnessed from a Siluri. The murmur of conversation died when the central doors opened. Consul Marindal walked in alone. She wore a simple dark suit, no medals, no insignia, nothing to suggest rank or power or authority, and she carried no data crystals and no documents and no prepared remarks. And she walked to the central podium with the same measured, unhurried stride she had used for 20 years. But the room reacted to her differently now. Censor and consciousness turned toward her, not with the polite tolerance she had endured for 2 decades, but with the absolute and undivided attention that is given to someone who has fundamentally altered the understanding of what is possible. She stood at the podium and looked out at the gathered civilizations of the known galaxy, and she let the silence hold for a long moment, because she had always understood the power of silence better than anyone in this room. Then she spoke. "I am not here to gloat," she said, "and I am not here to threaten, because if you have learned anything about humanity in the past week, I hope it is that we do not take pleasure in the fear of others." She paused. "I am here to tell you a story about my species, one that we do not often share, because it is not a story we are proud of." The chamber was utterly silent. "Before we came to the stars," Marin said, "we nearly destroyed ourselves, not once, not twice, but over and over again across thousands of years of our history. And we did it for the same reasons that every species in this room has done terrible things. Because we were afraid, because we were proud, because we convinced ourselves that strength meant domination, and that power meant the right to take from those who could not stop us." She looked at the Draelith delegation. "We built weapons that could crack the crust of our own world," she said, "and we pointed them at each other. And we lived for generations under the shadow of our own extinction. And we did not stop because we became wise. We stopped because we got lucky, and because enough of us decided that survival was more important than winning." She looked at the Voron delegation. "When we first made contact with the galaxy, we saw ourselves in you, all of you, the same patterns, the same hierarchies, the same conviction that the strong have the right to take, and the weak must simply endure. That if we showed you what we were, what we had been, what we are capable of becoming, you would either destroy us or force us to become the thing we swore we would never be again." She looked at the Siluri delegation. "So we chose a different path. We chose to be kind, not because we were weak, but because we knew exactly how strong we were, and we were terrified of it. Every smile I have given in this chamber was real. Every compromise was sincere. Every act of patience was genuine, but none of it was born from weakness." Her voice did not waver. It was born from discipline, the discipline of a species that looked into the worst parts of its own nature and decided every single day to be something better. She straightened. "You have seen a fraction of what we built in the dark," she said. "You have seen our ships and our drones and our soldiers and our alliances, and I know that right now you are afraid, and I understand that fear, but I want you to understand something else." She placed her hands on the podium. "We did not build those things because we wanted to use them. We built them so that we would never have to, and the fact that we revealed them, without firing a single shot, should tell you everything you need to know about who we are." She let that settle. "But discipline has limits," she said, "and patience is not infinite. And the next time a great power blockades a trade route and starves children to prove a political point, we will not come to this chamber and file a motion and watch it die on the floor." The silence was absolute. "So I am proposing something new," Marin said. "I am proposing that we change the rules, not through force, but through agreement. Not because one species demands it, but because all of us deserve it." She raised her voice just slightly, not to a shout, but to the clear and carrying tone of someone who intends to be heard by history. "Equity doctrine, a binding amendment to the Galactic Concord that states, in simple terms that every species can understand, that no civilization, regardless of its age or its power or its military strength, may blockade, annex, coerce, or threaten another, and that violations of this principle will be met with the collective and immediate response of every signatory, not as a favor, not as charity, but as law." She looked around the chamber. "Earth will be the first to sign, and we volunteer to be the primary enforcer, not because we want power over this galaxy, but because someone has to be willing to stand up first, and we have spent a very long time sitting down." The vote was called. It did not take long. The minor species voted in favor so quickly that the tallying system could barely keep up, and their votes were accompanied by sounds of approval that filled the chamber with a noise the Senate had never heard before, the sound of dozens of civilizations breathing freely for the first time. Ambassador Korath of the Drelith hegemony stood and cast his vote in favor, and he looked directly at Marin as he did it, and there was something in his ancient reptilian eyes that might have been respect. Ambassador Vrethka of the Varan Collective cast its vote in favor without speaking, and its mandibles were still, and its compound eyes were unreadable, and when it sat down, it looked smaller than it had before, not diminished, but recalibrated, as if it was seeing its own place in the galaxy with new and uncomfortable clarity. Ambassador Lumineth of the Siluri Dominion cast the final vote, and as the ancient energy being did so, it brightened for just a moment, a pulse of warm golden light that filled the chamber. And those who understood Siluri body language recognized it as something extraordinarily rare. Acknowledgement, the equity doctrine passed unanimously. No abstentions. Marin inclined her head in the same small nod she had always used, the same gesture the galaxy had once mistaken for submission. And she stepped down from the podium and walked out of the chamber. And this time, the doors did not close behind her in silence. This time, the chamber erupted. 3 days later, Marin stood at the window of her office in Geneva and watched the sun set over the old city, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. And the world was quiet in the way that only Earth could be quiet, with the sounds of birds and wind and distant laughter carrying through the evening air. Her aide Tobias stood in the doorway. "The last of the Voron supply reparations arrived at Haven's Rest this morning," he said. "Full medical packages, food stores for 6 months, and a formal invitation for the colony to participate in Voron cultural exchange programs." Marin nodded. "And the Jalvari Confederation is requesting a formal expansion of their defense pact," Tobias continued. "Along with the Tesseri and the Orin, and about 30 other species who apparently want to be our friends now." "They were always our friends," Marin said quietly. "They just could not afford to say so out loud until now. Tobias hesitated. "Ma'am," he said, "do you think it will hold? The peace, the doctrine, all of it? Do you think it will last?" Marin was quiet for a long time, watching the last light fade from the sky, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of a woman who had spent her entire adult life balancing on the knife's edge between what humanity was and what it could become. "It will hold," she said, "because now they know the truth about us. Not that we can destroy them, but that we spent a century making sure we would never have to." She paused, and the evening light caught her face, and for just a moment she looked like every human who had ever stood at a window and wondered whether the future would be kind. Said softly, "Is what terrifies them most." Outside, the stars were beginning to appear, one by one, in a sky that had once seemed impossibly vast and impossibly indifferent. And somewhere out there, among those distant points of light, 46 civilizations were learning to see humanity, not as it had pretended to be, and not as they had feared it might become, but as it truly was. A species that had walked through the fire of its own worst nature, and come out the other side, holding not a weapon, but an open hand. And the galaxy, for the first time in its long and violent history, reached back.